Pokemon on the 3DS is looked at as the peak of the series, but is it really the best? Pokemon games have always done extremely well on Nintendo consoles, and are one of the flagship series that help Nintendo stay as popular as they are today. And the 3DS era was no exception to this. Pokemon seemed to hit a stride on the 3DS, and even with some of the games that left fans wanting more, this era is still beloved by new fans and old fans alike. And it all started with Pokémon X and Y, which released worldwide on October 12th, 2013. Coming off the trail of Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 and the incredible success of the Pokemon series on the DS as a whole, the first two entries on the 3DS were going to be held to the highest possible standard. X and Y take place in the Kalos region, which is the Pokemon equivalent to France, and in my opinion is one of the most interesting regions to explore in the entire series. Once you begin your adventure, you meet your rivals, and yes, that's rivals plural. This is the first Pokemon game to let you have 4 rivals, if you can even call them that. Shauna, Tyrino, Trevor, and Callum or Serena, depending on who you choose in the game, are your rivals in this game, and they're more so your friend group than anything else. This is the era of Pokemon where they kind of get away from the typical rival experience that you had in the older games. And X and Y are given a group of friends who you see from time to time while you're exploring the region. I like how it's not just you and one other person through the story who you're competing against. You're given a group of people who you can compare yourself to throughout the entire story. After meeting your friends, you're given the selection between Chespin, Fennekin, or Froakie. Now, even though these are not the best starters overall, they aren't bad by any means. Froakie evolves into Greninja, which is one of the most beloved Pokemon designs as a whole, but the other two just felt kind of lackluster when compared to something so great. After progressing through the story a little bit more, you're given an additional starter in this game with either Charmander, Squirtle, or Bulbasaur. This is the first Pokemon game to give you 2 starter Pokemon right off the bat, and it actually is a really interesting idea in hindsight. After receiving your second starter, you're informed about Mega Evolution, which is the biggest change between the DS era and the 3DS era. It was the birth of the gimmick era of Pokemon. Prior to Pokemon X and Y, most Pokemon games felt more or less the same and didn't have any massive changes to the formula outside of new regions, new Pokemon, and sometimes new typings. But that all changed with the introduction of Mega Evolutions. Mega Evolutions were the first gameplay gimmick that Pokemon ever introduced and set the standard for the following games in the series. Mega Evolutions are additional evolutions that can be used in battle for certain Pokemon to give them additional boosts to their stats and a new form. These new forms were only able to be used in battle and expired at the end of the battle, so you could only use 1 per match. This gimmick, though simple, introduced so much variety into battles and was beloved by fans even to this day. Now, the only problem with this gimmick is that not every Pokemon has a Mega Evolution. Now, this does have its positives by adding a much stronger emphasis to team building, but it also leaves a lot of Pokemon who are entirely outclassed because they don't have a Mega Evolution that would make them more viable. Now, in order to Mega Evolve most Pokemon, you have to give them an item known as a Mega Stone. This takes the place of a held item, which makes it a much more tactical choice to see who your Mega Evolution Pokemon is going to be. Megastones are found throughout the world or given to you by NPCs and are a great way to add balance to this mechanic. So many people look at Mega Evolutions as the peak of Pokemon gimmicks, and that could be due to nostalgia, but at the same time it was also the perfect gimmick to add to the game, because it didn't change the formula all that much and it added some variety that Pokemon was in desperate need of. Once you've accepted your second starter Pokemon, you head out on your mission to find out more about Mega Evolution, and along the way you meet Lysander and Team Flare. Team Flare's goal is to destroy humanity and make a more beautiful world for Pokemon to live in. It's not until later in the game that you find out that Lysander is actually the leader of Team Flare, but I mean, look at him. I feel like Helen Keller could tell that he was the leader from a mile away. Team Flare, in my opinion, is the single most underrated villain organization in all of Pokemon. Their goal was really interesting, and how it ties into the story was almost perfect. As you progress through the story, learning more about Mega Evolution and beating more gyms, you finally have your standoff with Lysander after the 7th gym. You find out that he plans to use this weapon of mass destruction that was used 3,000 years ago to end the war between Pokemon and the Kalos region. You're informed by a man who is 74 feet tall, known as AZ or Az, of this war and how he lost his Floatette during the war, and his love for the Pokemon was his driving force of using this weapon, but the Pokemon abandoned him after he saw what he had done. The weapon was powered by whichever Pokemon was on the box for your game, and once you foil Lysander's plans to reuse this weapon, you get to catch that Pokemon. Pokemon X and Y have one of the most underrated stories in the entire series, and in my opinion is one of the most underrated Pokemon games as a whole. One of the most controversial changes to this game was the graphics. Every Pokemon was changed from a sprite to a 3D model, and this created a civil war in the Pokemon community. Some people like myself favored the sprites and felt that they brought a better representation of these Pokemon onto the screen, and some people preferred the 3D models because they're wrong. I don't think the 3D models did bad by any means, I just think the sprites did a better job at conveying the personalities of the Pokemon that were available. Pokemon X and Y also introduced the first new Pokemon type since the second generation of Pokemon in the Fairy type. This was desperately needed to counter Dragon types, which have been sweeping teams as far back as Generation 1. Fairy is such an interesting type because it took so many Pokemon that just had a single type and gave them the addition of being Fairy types. Adding a new type of Pokemon is never a simple thing to do, and it changes so much to the game, and we haven't gotten a new type since the addition of Fairy types so long ago. And the best thing that Fairy types brought along with it was the addition of Klefki. I mean, look at this guy. Do you think we could have survived this long without him? Also, with the transition to 3D, this is the first game to introduce a new movement mechanic with roller skates. This allowed people to glide around the map at high speeds, and the only real problem with this mechanic is that they were not able to be toggled on or off. Beyond roller skates, all of the other changes to the series were kept for future entries in the series, such as our next games, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which were remakes of the Generation 3 games. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire released in Japan and North America on November 21st, 2014. These games took the fan favorites of Ruby and Sapphire and put them onto modern hardware. Just like the originals, these games took place in the Hoenn region. You were given the choice between the starter Pokemon of Mudkip, Trico, and Torchic. These starters are still beloved to this day, and for great reasons. They had incredible balance and awesome designs. What Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire did so well was take the original source material and stick to it while adding twists from the modern games. These games took the fan favorite Mega Evolutions and added it to these older titles, and it was a perfect way to introduce quality of life adjustments to a game. This game also added new Pokemon Mega Evolutions, including all 3 starters, which got their own. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are some of the best Pokemon remakes of all time, and for great reason. All of the quality of life improvements are vast and added source material without taking anything away. The story of these games is the same as in Ruby and Sapphire, where you're tasked with taking down either Team Aqua or Team Magma, depending on what game you're playing. These games are looked at as the premier way to play the Gen 3 games because they took all of the problems that those games have and got rid of them. Keeping Mega Evolutions was the perfect addition to this game and should be the standard way that Pokemon remakes work. Unfortunately, it's not always this way when you look at games like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, but that's a topic for another video. Now, these games were not 100% perfect by any means. The interactions with Latios and Latias felt extremely forced in order to use a flying mechanic. Now, I really like this mechanic overall, but I feel like Latios and Latias lost their charm because they were forced onto the player without having to do anything to get them. That was the exact opposite way they were in the original games, and they were very hard to get in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Even though they added things to this game that made it a lot easier, you didn't have to use them. Now, once you beat the game and catch Groudon or Kyogre, in the original games, the story's over, but in order to pay homage to Pokemon Emerald, this game included the Delta episode, which is the post-game story available in this game. It was extremely refreshing to have this as an option and a great way to pay homage to Pokemon Emerald. In the Delta episode, you have to stop a meteorite from crashing into the Earth by using Mega Rayquaza to stop it. This allows you to catch the mythical Pokemon Deoxys for the first time without an event. Now, Deoxys is one of my favorite Pokemon, and I love the fact that he was able to be caught in this game so easily. All of that said, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are looked at as the best Pokemon games to come out for the 3DS, and for great reason. They're absolutely the best way to play the Gen 3 games, and are some of the most fun that I've had in the Pokemon series. The next main series Pokemon games released for the 3DS were Pokemon Sun and Moon, which released on November 18th, 2016 in Japan and North America. These games take place in the Alola region, which is the Pokemon equivalent of Hawaii. There are 4 main islands that you get to explore throughout your journey, and I find it is a really refreshing take to have 4 little mini regions spread out across the game. Now, to be honest, Pokemon Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are my least favorite games in the Pokemon series, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy my time playing them. You start off this game by rescuing Lily and her Pokemon that she calls Nebby, who you'll find out later is important if you can't tell by looking at them. Now this is the only Pokemon game to not offer a typical gym battle experience. Now this game replaces gym battles with trials, which are challenges that take place on any of the islands as a way to prove your strength as a trainer. They are essentially gym battles, but just a little bit different. Most trials take place by fighting a stronger version of a Pokemon known as a totem Pokemon, and then taking on the trial captain. Now it's not that I dislike this feature, but I felt like it was a weird change to make. I get it's a different region with its own culture, and I like how you're pretty much testing out the region's first go at a Pokemon League equivalent. But these challenges felt too easy, and there were only 7 in the game. These challenges also didn't synergize well with the story, and made me feel like I was taking on 2 separate tasks as opposed to one continuous journey. Now this game's story is kind of weird. It's definitely not bad, but it's not my favorite. The main antagonist team is a group called Team Skull, who are a bunch of people who dropped out of the trial challenge and who are now just thugs who walk around the islands causing trouble. They are extremely goofy and don't have a lot of personality beyond them just being, for lack of a better term, dumb. They are propped up by the Aether Foundation, who are a shadow organization whose goal is to protect Pokemon from various threats that could occur. Now the Aether Foundation is funding Team Skull, who essentially does their dirty work. This game focuses on the Ultra Beasts, which are a new form of Pokemon that come from different dimensions and are wreaking havoc on the region due to the Aether Foundation's activities. My main issue with Sun and Moon is that the game doesn't feel like a mainline Pokemon game. Though this game keeps the ability to use Mega Evolutions, they also add their own gimmick of Z moves, and they just don't feel like enough change to make the gimmick worth noting. Some Pokemon will get their own unique Z moves, which are a little more interesting than others, but ultimately fell flat, and I don't find myself using them unless I absolutely need to. About a year later, Pokemon heard the feedback from these games and released successor games to this series, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which released on November 17, 2017 worldwide. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are an enhanced version of Sun and Moon with practically the same story and a better variety of Pokemon and a more difficult game. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are more comparable to Platinum than Black and White 2 because it's more of an enhanced version than a successor game. Pretty much everything I said about Sun and Moon still stands with the Ultra games, except for the fact that these games add on more Pokemon into the routes and add some quality of life adjustments that make the game more approachable and less annoying throughout the game. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon offer a much better experience and are the best way to play the Gen 7 games because of the final battle at the end and the overall upscaling of quality throughout the game. Having the option to have a more challenging experience is something that I look for in a Pokemon game, because it's nice to be able to scale up the difficulty once in a while, but I was disappointed to see that these games were so similar to the first games that it felt like a waste of time to play them. The Alola region had so much potential, and I really hope that Pokemon goes back and remakes these games in a way that gives them the light that they truly deserve. Ultimately, I think the best games on the 3DS were either X and Y or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, because Sun and Moon games just felt like there were too much of a deviation from the standard Pokemon experience. But all these games were still really fun if you enjoy the series and want something to play. They're not bad by any means, but they're definitely not held to the same standard as the other games in the series. But one thing the 3DS did for Pokemon that the other consoles didn't is have the virtual console that allowed you to play the older games on the 3DS from the Game Boy Color. In 2016, you were able to purchase Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow on the virtual console for the 3DS, and this was the first time that Pokemon made their old games available on the digital format. These games had the ability to connect to the Pokemon Bank, which means you could transfer these games all the way up to Scarlet and Violet if you wanted. A year later, in 2017, you were able to download Gold, Silver, and Crystal on the Virtual Console as well. Now, a lot of fans, such as myself, were disappointed that you weren't able to get the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games on the Virtual Console, but I'll take what I can get here. Especially with the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I didn't feel like it was really necessary to get the Gen 3 games on the Virtual Console, which really only left Fire Red and Leaf Green, which were again available essentially with Red and Blue. But the 3DS was pushing boundaries in the Pokemon series that haven't been pushed to this day. It's impossible to play some of the old games on the Switch, and that was something that was the standard on the 3DS, and it's something that I really miss about the 3DS era of Pokemon. Considering the 3DS was backwards compatible with the DS, that means you could get any Pokemon from any generation onto the console with relative ease. Now, is Pokemon the best on the 3DS? As far as the original games go, no, not really. But as far as accessibility for the series and the quality of life adjustments that the fans wanted, Yes, this was absolutely the best time to be a fan of Pokemon. If you made it this far in the video, I just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you liked anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.